so much for having me here. It's such a cool hall, isn't it fantastic? Really beautiful. I want to thank Company NA and my hosts, my new friends, Norman Piasans, Aldis Janovitz, and Rietvars Shakals, and my old friends, TMB, Colin Waters, and Chris Curran, for having me. Lucky to be here. Just a chick from New York City, flying halfway around the world to share ideas about light. And we're really ambassadors, lighting designers. It's a global message that we bring, a spirited message of language that transcends all of our regions. I'm a lighting designer. Lighting is my art, my craft, and my business. My canvas is black. I see in the dark. Light is one of the world's most amazing, mysterious, organic, healing, stimulating substances and influences in our lives. Light drives our existence, and it informs our bodies as well. It's well documented that light bypasses the prefrontal cortex of the brain. That is the portion of the brain that's responsible for intellectual thought, executive action, problem solving. Light goes first to the amygdala, which is the reptile brain, the reptilian brain, and it communicates to the limbic system, which is the part of the nervous system that's responsible for your emotions, fear and survival. So imagine that light gets to you before you can think about it. And there are actually cells in the body that perceive light without your eyes. And it's in all animals. They're just now finding it out in humans. So we have a power that we bring to our audiences that is beyond our imagination. And I imagine that you have experienced this in your work, that essentially nothing that we can say or do in advance will really communicate what will occur for someone when they actually see the light. Light is visceral. It communicates to the nervous system. So it is a very deep and powerful process that we control, which is really exciting and fabulous. So you might be wondering why I might be a person of thought leadership on light. I've been a professional lighting designer for 35 years. I've been a Broadway lighting designer for 30 years. But I am coming to you from 3 different disciplines, from Broadway, from Hollywood, and also from the music industry. Broadway and the music industry were what I started in simultaneously, and I got to film a little bit later in my career. And when I learned that I would have the opportunity to address you, I had to think about what you might already know. I assume that you know quite a lot about lighting design, about technology, about people management, and I thought what I could bring is just what is possibly different that I do from what you do. I imagine most of it's probably the same. But I thought that I could share some of my perspectives and give you just a peek into my playbook. And so I'd like to share just a few definitions and goals and what I call imperatives and practices that I use in my work. I want to give you just a little bit of insight about my background, just so that you might hear from me anything that resonates for you in your background, if you're aspiring or you're building your career, to give you what the elements were that I had to work with. I think one of the most remarkable things about my background is that it was unremarkable. I had no artists in the family, nobody, of course, in lighting at all, no one in show business in my family and entertainment of any kind. And I also did not have the advantage of a financial background from my family that would support, let's say, an artist endeavor. Nothing like that. But I did have a couple of advantages, what seemed modest, but turned out to have quite a large impact on my career. One is, I grew up in New York, and I was exposed to forms of entertainment and had access to forms of entertainment in New York. The other big impact was that around the age of 5, I started taking piano lessons. So right around the time I started to read music, learn to read music. And the training program that I participated in was a dual track. It was performance, playing, and music theory. Music theory being the understanding of the creation and the structure and form of music. So you couldn't take one without the other, so we were forced to take music theory. And I played very studiously, and I was a pretty good student. But my piano teachers figured out along the way that I was not destined to be a concert pianist. But what was interesting was they noticed two things that ended up having, again, a huge impact on me. One was, at a very young age, they could see that among the genre of music that we studied, Baroque, classical, romantic, and contemporary genre, they saw that I was expressive when I was playing the romantic composers, that I, at a young age, like 8, 9, 10 years old, I was emoting while I was playing composers like Chopin, Debussy, Grieg, Prokofiev. I excelled somehow in this emotional expression. The other thing that they found out was that upon testing, which we had testing every year, they found I had perfect rhythm, which they explained, to my parents. They don't know really where it comes from. It's a little bit like perfect pitch. Some people have it, some people don't. They didn't quite know with me at such a young age how I could hear rhythm, and I could dictate it. I could write it out with very little flaws in it. Again, very, very young age. So those two things we didn't know, but there it was. And around the same time, my folks somehow, the soundtracks from Broadway musicals started to trickle into the home. And I loved those musicals, and I used to dance and sing around the living room, and I thought really what I wanted to do was tap dance. I really wanted to be a tap dancer. But I had the opportunity to hang around a local amateur theater company in my town. And so at around age 13, I started to hang around this theater. And I would do very menial things. I had no skill. I used to wash out paint buckets and sort hardware and so on. And one day, the grown-up who was responsible for running the light board for rehearsal didn't show up. So they said, okay, girlie, you go over there. And they showed me in the little pinch handles of the little Century Edcatron SCR dimmers at the time. And they gave me like a list of cues, and they kind of showed me what to do. I didn't know what I was doing, no idea. But I did notice that at the other end of this handle, the light would sort of seem to bloom in this kind of way. It had this kind of fluid, blossoming motion at the end of this thing. And I responded to that immediately because it was like the piano in a way. It was like playing with the pedal. So I got instantly attracted to it, and I started hanging around that theater company like as many hours and days as I could, and I did my first lighting design at 15. At 17, I got into university in a training program that was drama. In those days, you couldn't just study lighting. It was like too early for that. And the drama program, it was at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You had to train in every facet of the theater. So I worked, eventually I was a professional welder. I was a professional rigger. I loved to rig, I could climb and all of that. And eventually I, practiced. And of course in New York, when I got to New York, I worked as an electrician for a while. But the track, it was to assist designers. So I started to assist a little bit, and I met Jules Fisher, who was my hero, and eventually bothered him to the point that he hired me and assisted him for many years, and eventually we started to design together, and we became partners. And around 2000, we started to get exposed to doing some specialized lighting for film, which was really, really exciting to me. But I hadn't trained in the film industry at all, and I didn't know the craft. But I was so well trained in the theater that I would go around to every single department on a film shoot, kind of one group at a time, and ask if I could trail them so that I could, for example, learn how they checked the gate before they broke the shot, or I could learn how they would take the film out of the camera and put it in the canister and write the slip for the lab. I could put it on a Steadicam. I trained myself because of my training, both in piano and then in the theater. And I guess that just boils down to being really a life learner. And so everywhere I work, I try to learn every single part of the craft. And so you can see in something like Beauty and the Beast, where we're now working in digital animation. So, and we've done actually some other projects that have been just animated, no lights, no electricity, just working in animation. But what I'm bringing to it is musicality. So it isn't necessarily knowing how to do digital lighting per se as a technical skill, but bringing the musicality, the bloom of the light and how it responds. So that's how I've proceeded through the industry and how we've branched out. And that's why working in multiple disciplines, they feed each other. And it's good economically to cross over, too. So I can say I highly recommend that. So people often ask us, the most popular question is, what is the most challenging thing about being a lighting designer? What's the hardest thing about being a lighting designer? And the answer, the number one answer is always the same: communicating what it is we do. And you have to imagine that from a producer's point of view, or even a director's point of view, but particularly a producer's point of view, lighting is a huge leap of faith. It's very expensive. We have no way really to show what it is we're going to do. And even with previs and all the previses in the world, it's never going to equal the feeling, real feeling that you're going to get by being in that blue light, or by seeing just even what we saw right before my session here at the other end. So stimulating. And there's no way to get that across. Now, we have to use vocabulary. We have to use all the best possible practices. But we also have to educate and engage the creative people, even directors and other designers that we've worked side by side for years are baffled by exactly how we get to what we get to with the combination of equipment and digital and space and reflectivity and brightness and flow and so if you can start from the point in your process, in your mind's eye, start in the middle or the 1/3 point where everyone is going to be in the room with you in the light, and they are going to have that physical, visceral feeling. Back up to the beginning of your process and just say to yourself, I know we're going to get to that point where everyone is going to feel it and embrace. So try to make that early period as supportive and palatable, and give it as much understanding to the others as you possibly can, because they cannot perceive anything what you're doing. As much as we try, I mean, people glaze over when we even start to talk about conceptual ideas. And we've been chatting among ourselves about things like previs, which is so valuable on so many levels, but still you never really feel it. So that is something that I think we want to try to be understanding about. I learned a very valuable lesson. We have a show running in Las Vegas, a big show, a big spectacle, like Cirque du Soleil style. And when we got involved and started to plan the production and started to process the design, I was in the position of constantly needing resources. That's all I did, was communicate the resources that we needed, the manpower, the lights, the time, the other departments. It was just all I would do was communicate, we need this, we need this, we need this. And it was met by essentially the technical managers with why? Why do you need that? And I took that why from them always to mean prove it. You prove why you need those man hours. You prove why you need those lights. and it was my partner actually who helped me reframe it. They were not saying prove it, they were saying explain it. Explain why you need. So I was able to respond from less of a defensive position and more supportive and less aggressive reaction to that. So that helped me really understand where people are coming from. I'd like to give a couple of definitions, old and new, of stage lighting. One that we like a lot, that we subscribe to, is from Max Reinhardt, who was an Austrian theater director in the early 20th century. He said, "Lighting is making pictures that communicate. Lighting is molding a three-dimensional space, a black void, by putting light where you want it, and equally important, taking it away where you don't want it." We had an early definition that we used for a long time, which was stage lighting consists of a series of still lighting states which reveal a scene and which transform from one to the next in a succession, unfolding over a prescribed time. But we went on to modify that in the last 10 years, and we subscribe to this now. Lighting design is the flow of a luminous liquid plasma used to evoke emotion and reveal a time and space to tell a story. Luminous liquid plasma. In the theater, stage managers are responsible for calling lighting cues. And we have been telling them in the past few years, it used to be that a stage manager would call a cue, and their sense of it is that they're triggering an event to happen. But now, really, they're triggering the flow to turn on, which will either run out or will be transformed by triggering another flow. So we think of it as like a liquid flow that are now the cue sequences that we create. We also are working in the theater with what we call dramatic time. And so we are taking and crafting time using seconds broken down, but we're actually creating time that is not so linear, that is plastic, and that is accelerating, decelerating. And when you imagine in the theater and like in film, where you maybe flash back or you're jumping ahead in time, you're taking in the various stories, you're breaking out of normal time. And lighting is a real agent of flow, of speeding up and slowing down. So we can take one moment and have it last for an entire song, and then carry on with a narrative that may be happening in storytelling real time. So dramatic time is another element that we're crafting on its own to be dynamic, and that's something that we want to work with that stylistically and make it specific to every performance, every show that we do. So here are just a couple of our imperatives. These are what we consider to be non-negotiable tenets of creating our own work on every show, that it guides our design and that we look for solving these imperatives on every show that we do. The first one is make it beautiful. So no matter how dark or tragic or sorrowful or stark or scary a scene might be, we still want the eye to perceive it as a striking, artistic, beautiful image. And sometimes the strongest contrast can create the most dramatic tension. But even sometimes the dimmest, softest light might be the saddest light. And we want to take every image and touch it with something beautiful. That's in the eye of the beholder, but that's an imperative that we use. Another is light in the shadows. So imagine that you have shadows in whatever key lighting or whatever key and secondary lighting that you may have, but the shadows in real life and nature are rarely black completely. And we want to be able to touch color into those shadows to give some other feeling of emotion, or even some other feeling of being in an otherworldly state, something that is pulling us away from reality. Because we're not trying to create reality on stage. We're trying to create a believable spirit of reality. And lighting in the shadows is a equally important and another beautiful part of the painting that we do. So we never leave a shadow unconsidered. We might leave it black, but we will always consider it. And another is we seek to be finishers. We try to finish our work. And this goes all the way back to my piano lessons, really, which is the polishing of something that you're working on creatively. A lot of times in our business, we just work until the time runs out. Like, we work like mad, but we stop. We don't actually finish. So consider, what are the grace notes, or what are some of the finishing touches that you can bring to your project? Maybe you only have the ability to do a few things, but if it means maybe making something completely seamlessly smooth at the end, or putting in that little extra pop of cymbal crash or a drum beat or something. But whatever it is, consider the finishing of it. And then this is, I think, my number one to offer to everyone. It goes to, I believe Walt Disney said this, and I have it on my mirror at home. If you can imagine it, you can do it. And my strongest sense of design is we visualize, we think in the dark, we see in the dark, we start from a dark image in our head. If you can think of some image in your head for a scene, for a moment, whatever it is that you are devising in your head, and you can execute it using all of your best practices and your planning and your layouts and all the beam angles that you've worked with and everything, you can execute it. You have successfully completed the loop, the closed circuit loop of successful design. If you can think of it, visualize it, and execute it. It doesn't matter if anybody thinks it's good. It doesn't matter if critics or even the director thinks it's good. It doesn't matter if it's what everybody thought they talked about. But the truth is, if you see it here and you can execute it here, that is the strength of your artistic, creative lighting design track, is to stay with that, because that will get stronger and stronger and stronger. And so the more you're able to absorb what everybody wants or expects of you, you can think it here and execute it there. And I'd like to talk about a practice that we work with all the time, something that we've been working on for a long time, understanding. Is everyone here familiar with good, fast, and cheap? The triangle, good, fast, cheap? Yes? Right, you can only get two, right? If it's good and fast, it's not going to be cheap. If it's cheap and fast, it's not going to be good. And if it's good and cheap, it's not going to be fast. Is that right? Okay. So, that applies to all of the work that we do. But the number of restrictions that we are met with as lighting designers it does boil down to good, fast, cheap. But you're taking good off the table because you know it's got to be good. We're not going to navigate getting away from good. So now you're into time and money, basically. And so many of the jobs that we do have multiple restrictive elements. Some of them may be creative restrictions, and some of them are practical. A creative restriction might be that in Beauty and the Beast, in this splashy musical number, it was 1700 and there's no electricity. So conceptually, we had to dream up, how do you make a splashy number in a time where there was no electricity? And so the development of those ideas had to do with light that was only coming from the fireplace, the candelabra, the windows, the moonlight coming through the windows, and all of the light that you see in that number is reflected off of the objects. But there was no electricity. So that's an example of a creative restriction. Practical restrictions, there are a million of them. And I think the practice that we use is to try to figure out what we call the key drivers. What are like the top two absolute restrictions? For example, you could only get into the hall at midnight and the show is at 8 a.m. That's a key driver. It's immutable. There's nothing you can do about that. Or let's say you're navigating a tour and you can only have half of a truck for lighting equipment. And there are many of those. But the idea is to figure out which are the ones that you absolutely have to adhere to, and then how do you maximize the impact out of the other elements that you have available to you. Maybe you're working with an inventory, and the inventory isn't anything that you would choose, but they have a lot of one thing, and you think, okay, well, that I can maximize a creative idea using that restriction, but then that becomes my area of impact. The most important thing is to figure out where is your impact coming from. So, and that's what we would call bang for your buck. Where can you get that in the design? But producers understand that all of the separate elements that make up lighting design, that require time and money, all of them could individually be reduced a little bit. So they might have a couple of key drivers that have to do with setup time or rental budget, but they will say, but we can't give you the extra programming time. Can't you do it with a little bit less programming time? Surely you could, because we've done another show with a little bit less programming time. Or it's just going to be a little bit less lights. Surely you can do it with a little bit less lights. And they will categorically go through every single separate element that creates your design by reducing it all down to its tiniest viability. But now you have no margin for error. And perhaps you've lost your zone of impact. So when you identify the key drivers, the restrictions that are immutable, you create your immutable zone of impact of what are you going to use to make the design have a bang for the buck. What are you going to capitalize on? There are so many areas to consider. For example, how far away is the last row of your audience? That's a brightness issue that you have to think about. How many people do you have to light at once on a set? That's a coverage issue. So, we also have to separate all these things and figure out how we're going to solve our key problems and the key drivers. But we have to create our own flexibility within that, because they will come after us to try to minimize every single one of those areas, and pretty soon there's the strength of the design has been compromised. So you have to hang on to those ideas that you think will deliver the show, and hold firm on the things that, yes, maybe you could do it with a little bit less. Well, we sometimes say in film, it would apply to anything, but in film, we have a sort of a model that we come in with about how to do this kind of specialized lighting. And they say, well, we know you have a model, but we want you to do it a little bit faster than that. But we also want you to do it with a smaller setup time. But we also want to do it with a programmer who's never really done this kind of thing. And basically we say, you can do like 2 big things a different way, and maybe a couple of small things a different way. But you can't do everything a different way, because then we can't deliver to you. So that is our practical sensibility that is to support the designer and to maintain a strength in the design. And lastly, I would just say, sometimes it's lonely and scary. And when you're starting out and you're getting your career going, it's very stimulating, it's very exciting. But this kind of career, it does have seasons. And you may wake up sometime or be on the middle of a tough show and feel really exhausted and really uninspired or less inspired. And I think we have to, kind of reach down within and seek mastery of it. It's noble, and it's a way to find inspiration, is to appreciate beauty, appreciate other artists' work, and let that fill you up, because sometimes there can be a sense of burnout that's really kind of hard to get past. But if you just realize something that's beautiful, look for some beauty, and let that rejuvenate you a little bit, and look to other artists to the work that other people are doing for inspiration. I'd like to read one quote to finish that I love, because I've had multiple seasons in my career, and I do hit a wall sometimes, and this is something that always gets my juices flowing again. This was in an interview of Peter Martins, who was the ballet master at the New York City Ballet for many years after George Balanchine. This was in an interview on 60 Minutes. He said, "We all cannot lose touch with the difficulties of mastering classical ballet to the extreme, utmost beauty. It is such an impossible task, you will never attain it, and we know it, but you have to strive for it." So, thank you. I wonder if I could take a few questions. Are there any questions that anybody might have? Anything you want to ask?
First, I would like. Yeah. Hello. First, I would like to thank you.
Uh-oh.
First, I would like to thank you for the inspiring speech. And you've been working in this industry for so many years, and the industry itself has changed, and the technologies we have available has changed. And how does the technology has changed your designs through these years?
The advancement of technology has given us a huge amount of creative headroom. I feel, especially from my beginning, that fluid resolution control of light has become so easy and so innate for me. To me, it makes it more organic. The idea that light flows so fluidly and so seamlessly. And I know I've said this, almost the same words to describe. But it was really not possible like that. And even the idea that you could take a moving light and have it start slow and get a little fast and slow down again, it has a really, we can make these changes feel very organic. And that adds to a certain kind of believability, I think, for an audience. Again, it's the perception of light, not the intellectual response to it, but just there is a visceral, physical perception of light change that is like our waking lives. And the more control we have of that in our stage or film settings, the more we believe the place of the story. So to me, it's the resolution that has become so magnificent. The ability to go from any color to any color seamlessly, and changing time seamlessly. That's been really dynamic, really great. Anyone? Yes, here? Okay.
Hi, yeah, it's been a pleasure having you here. I'm a fellow drama student as well. If you have a moment later, I'd love to ask a few questions, but mine's quite specific because before you started your speech, there was information that you worked on lighting design for Angels in America,
Yeah.
and it's my absolute favorite play. I personally studied drama in University of Greenwich in London, and I saw the show that was there. But I would love to hear maybe a little bit more what exactly you worked on there, and maybe you could just elaborate a little bit to the audience here, like what the play is about, so that they get the idea.
Right. Well, I did the original Angels in America. I didn't do the recent production. Yeah. It's an epic play in two, Angels in America is an epic play in two parts, a gay fantasia on American themes, and it was written by Tony Kushner, and it was a complex story about a period in history when AIDS was taking over in New York, and that there was, I don't know how to describe this, that there was an angel on the other side that was communicating. I'm not exactly sure how to elaborate in terms of the actual production. It was a brilliant director, George Wolfe, who we've worked with many, many times. And it was, the style of it was sort of magic realism. It was not an absolutely realistic play. It was done with fragments. And I'm not sure what to impart about it. It was complicated, and it was 2 evenings.
I don't know, maybe your favorite moment?
There were so many. I mean, they were individual. I'm sorry. I'm not being coherent about it. Well, you'll try to jog my memory when we speak. Sorry, that's not a totally satisfactory answer. Anyone else?
Good morning. Thank you for your beautiful speech. And you mentioned in the beginning that the light is a healer. There was a sentence. So maybe it's what do you think about daylight in the context of entertaining, and if we deal about energy efficiency and sustainability, and if there will be, if the electricity will be expensive and there will be maybe lack of electricity, what will happen with and what you think about this? Thank you.
Yeah, about daylight, about actual daylight. I mean, one of the things that's amazing right now about the LED inventories that we're using is that we're using a lot less electricity. And tours are now going out, some of them with no dimmers at all, which is really quite a miracle. I mean, we have some pretty good quality light substitutes for daylight that we do use in the theater. And so I'm not exactly sure if you mean what happens when we are doing theater out of doors, which is great too. But we have some amazing, and I'm just going to say, this TMB gear is crazy useful for this type of broad, soft, controllable day quality. The softness of it's very, very hard to get really soft in the theater with control. So and we've been exploring that a lot, and the healing aspect of it is, first of all, I don't know if you're aware that there's a thing called seasonal affective disorder, which is that when we respond to the shorter days in the winter season in places where it's dark in the winter, people have a certain special brand of depression surrounding the darkness and the circadian rhythm. And one of the things that is available now that is absolutely scientifically shown is that if you put yourself in front of a 5,600 degree panel for a half an hour in the morning, it will improve your mental stability if you are suffering from that form of depression. Light therapy is a real thing. And it's really, really amazing and exciting that we're part of it. Anyone else? Yes?
What do you think about LEDs and tungsten lamps, about the spirit of lamp? What is your vision of it?
Yeah, you said it right, because it's a spirit. You know, tungsten, a tungsten source is fire. And we have a relationship to fire. Again, the visceral, you know, it's like we're the moth and the flame. It goes back to somewhere back in our DNA. I'm not first of all, I would hate to lose incandescent altogether, but I'm not a super purist, and I'm not a person who struggles with the LED. We were talking about this the other night. I feel like I can get color where I need it to be, and I can also boost it with contrast of other color to make it more believable. So putting a cool light next to a warm helps the warm be warm, if you know what I mean. But I know that there's a big movement to save the tungsten, and you know, we're trying too. But listen, it's a tsunami. The Chicago, the film of Chicago, was shot on film. I mean, they're not making shows on film anymore, unless you're like Steven Spielberg. It's all digital. So I don't know where the wave is gonna, you know. I find myself stockpiling my garage with the original sources that aren't going to be sold anymore. I'm not a super purist about it, but I appreciate it, and I think you're right. I don't know what the audience's perception is of LED not making it communicate the way that tungsten does. I'm not sure. I'm interested in what other people have to say. There's something here.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your speech. Question is not lighting related, but more like life related. Can you give a couple advices of how to remain a good balance between work and family? Because we all want to become good professionals, but family is very important. How to keep that balance?
Yeah, work-life balance. Everyone struggles with that, I think. The model that I used was, I chose the path of an artist before everything else, and to the exclusion of some other parts of my life, because I felt that strongly about it. I felt that I had a gift. But I follow the example of other artists who do it. So what I would recommend is find somebody else who you think has it all together. And it may be, and some of the folks that I work with, you know, they're on the road, they're here now, they have families back home, but they manage in a particular way and have a deal with their family that they're going to leave, as they sometimes say. I worked with a woman choreographer, and we were in London shooting a picture, and she had two little twin babies, and she said it's a little bit like being in the military. You kiss the babies goodbye and you go. I don't. It's different for everybody, but what I recommend is model somebody else who's doing it the way you think it's right. Like the way, if you can appreciate how somebody else has it balanced, maybe model that. Instead of like maybe having to try to invent the whole thing yourself, trial and error, but like look after someone else. And that's what I did. I modeled the people in New York who were lifers, meaning full-time theater professionals, and how they operated their lives. They would work like crazy, work on Broadway for months, get the thing open, and take a month off or take 3 weeks off and regroup and fill the artists well. So I would model somebody. Okay, anyone else? No? All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.